Yeah, my name is Wiebe Overgaard. I'm a visual artist based here in Copenhagen. This first slide is just here to briefly introduce that my practice is time-based, and I work with performance and video, and I also work with text. But for what I want to be talking about today, it seemed most appropriate to take an immediate starting point in my sculptural work. These sculptures are generally based on shapes and material qualities that I have collected in a visual encounter with machines, factories, public infrastructure, and modern architecture. So it is an engagement with the aesthetic configuration of industrialism and modern capitalism, you could say. Inspiration comes from support structures, concretism, brutalism, and things like roadmaps or electronic circuit boards. So basically, the sculptural shapes derives from an aesthetic of function. And I think we will approach something that seems more appropriate for today's conference, but allow me to start here still. The sculptures are mostly made of clay. Actually, here there are also some elements made out of concrete, but mostly they're made out of ceramics. And in the intuitive process of building it, I try not to add anything ornamental. You can, of course, argue that the sculpture itself ends up serving no function, and in that way the whole thing is ornamental. And I will also quickly admit that it is not completely clear-cut, but I do try to be honest with myself to not add anything that doesn't somehow serve the constructural strength of the piece. So it feels like working somewhere in a cross-section between sculpting and engineering, maybe. This type of aesthetics is at the foreground of modern development, maybe more than something very contemporary. So perhaps they belong to a different time period in art and architecture in that sense. And in my artistic project, there is a lot of revisiting modernism going on. The desire to do so is partly formed in a response to the sort of neoliberal project of hiding structures. Buildings, for instance, are still made out of concrete, but now largely, like as what you would most commonly see, is that they're covered in panels or bricks. The digital screen that largely, make up a huge part of our lives, well, we only see the surface of them and not the algorithms and technology that's going on behind them. And also, it is still finance, production, and growth that sets the societal agenda, but now in a different way, masking as something else. Oh, wait, 1 second, that was too fast. These are some stills from a video that I made as a part of a project taking place in Aalborg, this northern city of Denmark. And I was looking at this specific city and its concrete industry to investigate the Scandinavian welfare ideology and its contradictions. Aalborg has really been a worker city with a social democratic identity anchored in factories and production. The slogan during most of the 20th century was "the city with the smoking chimneys." This is still from my video, and then there's also still from a promotional video done by Aalborg Portland Concrete Factory in the 50s. It is hard to imagine a city with this type of slogan today, even if the chimneys are still smoking and production for profit is still the undercurrent of life in the city. Today, the city brands itself completely different on culture, care, sustainability, and equal opportunity. And it is, of course, not that there's none of that going on, but it seems to be on the premises of the core opposite. So we can talk about a shift in the hegemonic narrative, very broadly speaking, as going from something of structural visibility and aesthetics of structural visibility to an age of surface and illusion. The Marxist take on things here would, of course, be that arguing that visibility of structures and production relations can form class consciousness and effectively agency to react to the status quo and politically mobilize. And then on the opposite end of this, the neoliberal paradigm puts people in an apolitical position where we are invited to participate in the way that things are designed for us without having a clear view into what is happening in the machine room. And this idea of the view into the machine room is something that I will be returning to as I, go over my practice. So yeah, maybe worth noticing a little bit. I will introduce only just one theoretical book, which is Technique and Magic by Federico Campagna. And I decided to do so to borrow some of his terminology to explain, what I want to talk about. In his book, Technique and Magic, he talks about the shift from the neoliberal age as the shift from Fordism to post-Fordism happening around the time of the 1970s. And he describes Fordism as a time where what industrial technique was doing was a translation of everything into its own logic and system. And post-Fordism would then be the time where that translation is completed, and we have now entered a stage where industrial technique gets to define everything. So he calls that total language. Where I wrote existence, I should probably have been writing instead the ineffable, because that's what Federico Campagna calls it. It's a little correction to the slide. And it's the ineffable because it is that which cannot even be uttered. You cannot even think it. So it's something like so beyond what we can imagine that you cannot even sort of go there. The reason why language is then such a central point is because it is not just about how materiality is systematized, but also our way of thinking again and how we are capable of experiencing things. And just to put things a little bit bluntly for the sake of understanding, you could maybe then say that my sculptural project, or what I'm trying to investigate, I'm trying to sort of go back to that state of translation. That's sometimes the feeling I have when I'm sort of engaging with these specific, very logical shapes. And the question is, of course, why would I stay there instead of trying to go beyond it? Just try to find some kind of doorway or pathway into something beyond this kind of claustrophobic idea of being so defined by this state of total language, right? And I guess I'm allowing myself to doubt a lot and hesitate a lot whether that kind of more free artistic expression would just put me right smack back into the state of total language. Maybe here I could also activate the term of cultural industry as defined by the Frankfurt School, and in particular Adorno and Horkheimer, where even the most authentic human experience we can think of is flattened out, printed on a postcard, and made part of culture as an industry. And I think here we are very much approaching the central question. Maybe we cannot go directly beyond the dimension that we are situated in, but how can we then still think about a transformative potential? And here also, to be a little bit more playful, I would like to introduce the magician. The magician can perhaps be seen as the druid or the shaman of Western mythology, but where the shaman in many ancient and indigenous cultures would be qualified by having an ability to transcend between different realms, so to speak, the magician is popularly thought of as someone with a set of abilities to do something, change things and manipulate them. And the image of witchcraft and sorcery is definitely also widely portrayed in popular culture, where it seems like magic is mostly the ability to effortlessly solve the kind of practical problems that technology is also working to solve, like transporting yourself over distances or communicating over distances so you don't have to transport your body, to talk to someone, or making food appear so you don't have to cook, or maybe even changing the landscape and behavior of other creatures so that your specific agenda will triumph that of others. It could also be to manipulate the flow of resources in your own direction. In other words, in this kind of way of magic, it is something very parallel to both technology and also economy. Smart technological solutions to elevate the burden of effort and economic solutions to secure individual power. And this is, of course, the magician in the tarot cards. And I find it, kind of telling that it is also card number 1 in the major arcana. So if that's the kind of the first stage of a person's process, it kind of makes sense that it's so initial, this step where we only just realize that we can do something. And of course, there might be a profound wisdom in the effort that the magician is trying to bypass. This, again, it's not about romanticizing human suffering and suggesting a sort of back to nature idea. But think about, for instance, the technology magic in the Matrix, where Neo has just joined the rebels and is doing a digital training program where he becomes a kung fu master in just a few hours. I guess there is a reason why he's still just a kung fu master inside of the program and not in the real world, because the spiritual essence in kung fu lies precisely in the time you spend, the way your body and your mind change when you devote yourself to something over time. So quite the opposite of what is going on here in this kind of sort of magical way of just becoming very skilled in a short time. And we also know the difference in the feeling of presence if you walk somewhere and you notice everything on your way compared to taking a plane, or the kind of sort of nutritional value and the kind of attention that goes into a home-cooked meal rather than like a microwave dish. And taking things a step further, there is also the difference between producing something on a local scale, where you can imagine like producing something in a way where you have an overview of everything that takes place in the production and its consequences, and then the production that takes place under global capitalism, where we only ever see a small corner of the whole machinery that is activated to bring a certain good to the shelf of a shop. It appears as if by magic. And in the process, we are not confronted with the exploitation that is part of the production process. And we feel alienated because we lack agency and leverage to take real responsibility. So the magician would maybe suggest a very direct, swift action or a direct, swift idea, but perhaps one aspect of the transformative potential that I was briefly approaching before is that it could be more connected to what is right here in front of us, in temporality and scale. I will return to this, but first I will just have a sip of water. And then I will introduce this project that I did that took its starting point in the textile industry. And so the sculptures are based on industrial looms, and then there's also a video. The reason why I approached this specific industry is because it also somehow belongs to a little bit my own heritage, because when I grew up, my father and grandfather had a carpet factory, and I remember these big industrial looms working in the factory hall. Now, today, the same kind of machines in that town can mostly be seen in the local historical museum, because most of the textile industry has, of course, been outsourced. So the machines seem kind of haunted both by this sense of local cultural identity that lies in the wake of these bygone industries. And also, here there is some kind of dream of a perfect world that seemed connected to that, stage of development in the industry. But also, then you could say that they're haunted by the suffering and exploitation that is undeniably a part of the production chain and the historical trajectory that the industrial looms are inserted in. And in the video, that is, it has this 3D animation. I used the metaphor of the fiber that winds through the looms. It becomes a metaphor for circuits of infrastructure, production change, and historical industrial development. And it also becomes a metaphor for energy and how it runs through the places where it finds the least friction. So simply energy. You see this shining animated line moving through something that looks like maybe an architectural landscape corresponding to my sculptures, or a computer circuit board. And to explain why it seemed relevant for me to use the metaphor of energy moving, I have to briefly go back to when I first started to become aware of the degree to which capitalism is the underlying condition of everything. I was particularly astonished by how it seems to be able to make anything work in its favor, make profit out of everything, even critique and protest. And the big unanswered question for me was, who the hell came up with this? Who could have thought this out and made it so perfect in its its course toward horrific course towards destruction. And the answer is, of course, no one. So maybe also this kind of energy can seem haunted, you know, because no one is moving it as such. No one started it, at least. It seems to be a kind of powerful force moving on its own and going to the places where it finds the least friction and optimizes its speed. In the same way that other types of energy will flow, at least until you redirect it. And of course, if we look at things in this way, even if no one as such started it, people are still maybe, you know, helping it to move along, but it also has a precondition that we could frame as surplus. So where hunter-gatherers can be said to move in a different type of calibrated unison with the natural environment, the generating of surplus in agriculture had set into motion a whole trajectory of class hierarchies, the use of money, and privatization. And then we can imagine that it just unravels, sort of, you know, or not, unravels, I guess you can say. I just want to underline again that here the project is not to see technology as the enemy and suggest that we go back to nature. For humans, the right kind, the right type of technology, and the right type of social organizing, I would say, is a matter of taking responsibility for the survival of our communities. But if we are talking long-term peaceful survival, the solutions have to be developed in a way so that they are attuned with ecological balances. So we're speaking of some dynamics here. And I started to think of it as dynamics of oppositional forces. As much as we need technology, we also need to tune in with the ways of nature. For humans, the rational mind that helps us organizing balances out with our feelings that helps us to know what is important, how it's important to organize. And our dreams of something outside of the dimension that we can sort of, kind of experience or relate to can be built maybe with an attention to the things that condition us right now. So this more political awareness that I was talking about before, and the look into the machine room. And I was thinking about this in relation to the sculptures also. Not to suggest that then these sculptures are kind of like solving this problem, but just to say what kind of thinking they allow as an engagement with form and material. Again, the sculptures have quite strict formal logical systems, like a systemic language that can feel like technique almost distilled for me. But then they're made out of clay that as a material feels very organic and hold other bodily qualities. And also the strings that maybe you remember from the sculptures seem to me to hold a different kind of sensibility than the heavier machine-like shapes. So I illustrate these dynamics to point out maybe mostly that thing in the middle, the cross-section. Inside of the defined categories, we can be very clear in our ways of understanding either nature or technology, or we can be clear about what other thing we dream of, or we can be placed very clearly in either an emotional or a rational state. And that clarity of those binaries means that we are thinking quite directly from within the system or systemic order of total language. But maybe somewhere where these forces meet lies the thing, that ineffable thing, that which we cannot think or articulate, but which we can approach. So instead of a beyond, there is maybe an in-between, is the suggestion here. And my suggestion is also that the ability, that even if we as individuals cannot change the current dimension from within, maybe slowly the collective can still transform the dimension if we practice our ability to push up against it. But my suggestion is that the ability to push up against something from within largely also relies on making ourselves continuously aware of the kind of power it has. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.